I'm Kim Scribner here with CMG, and I've got Gary Lancina joining me, and we're going to talk about the impact of change and maybe a little bit about what leaders should be doing about it. So, Gary, I'd like to kick it over to you and hear a little bit from you about where you think change hits first, or where's its first impact?
Oh, I think the first impact for any assertion of change starts in each individual recipient, right? And we'll contextualize this. This is not change like I'm hitting adolescence. This is change inside an organization when a leader stands up or sends out a note that says, we're going to do things differently, or we're going to be different in the future. And my strong belief is every individual who either hears or reads or perceives that, whether firsthand or secondhand, immediately asks themselves a few questions. The first is, what's in this for me? The second is, why? And the third is, am I really bought into this? And the answers to those three questions don't always align to have somebody then choose to opt in or be capable of choosing to opt in, right? Because if they say, what's in it for me? I don't know. Okay, that's uncertainty. If they say why, and there's any sense of question about the reasoning, well, I'm not sure I believe that, right? That creates another hurdle to get over before opting in. And then the last one is, am I capable of this, or do I want this? Might be a better question. Is really sort of reflective of the first two. Is there anything in this for me? Do I perceive why this is better for the organization? And am I going to commit to this cause? And those three questions, the answers to those for any individual either create a sense of optimism and certainty, or sort of uncertainty and skepticism. And, as a leader, we want to maximize the amount of commitment and that sort of collective optimism to make a change agenda happen. And getting there is often an exercise in reaching critical mass. So I'll pause there before I go on further, but that's kind of how I shape it.
Yeah, and what you're talking about, right? There's the optimism that can create the momentum, right? And so that kind of like amplifies the change and moves it forward. But then there's the uncertainty and that kind of ambiguity and not understanding the change that creates the resistance. And I think if we bring it down to kind of a more kind of granular level of where it hits. So you hit on we're changing something inside an organization. That might be the way we're working. That might be we have a new strategy to bring us forward. So if we're establishing a new strategy, the team that's creating the strategy feels the change first, right? They're being asked to put a strategy together in a different way. I think there's also a difference between a change and an impact point. And you've got kind of operational departments that sometimes aren't involved in creating the strategy, but are involved in
executing
on the change, right? And so they feel the impact maybe even deeper if they weren't involved in helping to establish that strategy.
Yeah.
And so you said something, and I'm going to kind of hit on something from where you grew up, right? We're going to talk about fault lines. And so, when we think about kind of fault lines and the things that are maybe kind of underneath the surface in an organization that we don't know are these tiny little cracks. And then if we think about the impact and where it hits, like all of those unknowns, even to us as leaders, things that maybe some of that resistance and uncertainty is coming from the little secrets that we keep as we're managing departments, right? Yeah. So, how have you seen leaders kind of navigate that well?
Well, and I'll stretch your sort of metaphoric model a little bit, and I appreciate it as a Californian, right? Fault lines come in lots of flavors, and the friction and tension that creates the slips or the rumbles, it's a great analog for what happens inside organizations. Oftentimes, there's a small group of people, frequently with big titles, who decide we're gonna alter something. We're gonna change technology or procedure or process or capabilities because it fits our strategic needs. And they declare this as if it's self-evident. And good enlightened teams, I think, should be reflecting on at least three sources of fault lines. One is, among that group that is making those assertions, how aligned are they truly? Are they acting in accordance with the premise that leadership is a team sport, and our alignment, not just on what the stated intention is, but all of the things that contribute to it? Oftentimes, even within a room of 7 to 10 individuals, there are going to be people who perceive strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats differently. And getting clarity there, that's sort of the first fault line. So that at least there's a unified front on the intention. The second is really the big visible fault lines. If you go to California, there are spots where you can stand and see where the San Andreas Fault has shifted over the years. And there's literally, a massive difference in sort of what ground level is. And those tend to be visible, like this function is going to respond this way, or this group of people are going to feel this way. The third, and those are often addressed, at least in some degree, by official channels, like trying to reach out and hold listening sessions, etc. But the third, and probably the most pernicious one, are all of what you call those little faults. They're unseen. And we don't necessarily perceive that the tension is there that's going to cause a rumble at some point. I think that the best leaders in this sort of transformational or change management space recognize that there are things they don't yet know or don't yet perceive. And it's like disaster planning. Even if you don't know specifically where it's going to happen, anticipating that those things are going to flare up helps create an openness to input, a receptivity to the dialogue or the gossip or the questions, or in some cases, the revolt, so that you can actually engage and work through it. And I think I don't want to be too Rumsfeldian here, but it's understanding there are things we don't know, and we may not know what we don't know. We can still prepare.
Yeah. So I think this concept of you can create a map of how the change is going to impact things, and you can identify the major fault lines like you talked about, and you can kind of note question marks where you think there's some uncertainty that could create some slippage. You gave me a little bit of PTSD when you talked about disaster recovery, because I used to run a disaster recovery team, and I'm thinking about tabletop exercises and making really very strange exercise to go through.
Yes.
What happens if the power grid goes out?
Yes.
How do you manage that as an organization? But doing things like that create the muscle memory and the capabilities in order to deal with any type of change, small, large, whatever
Correct.
happens, whether you have planned it yourself or someone else has a greater plan that has a change that comes. So this kind of practicing change idea for leaders and throughout middle management and upper management, I think is an important one, because it creates that, we know how to do this now. So if something
Correct.
comes our way, whether that's a change in the market that we didn't plan for or something we planned for ourselves, we're better prepared to deal with people, right? Is what we're really dealing with here. Is we don't know how humans are going to react to a change. And so we have to be listening all the time, like you're saying.
Absolutely.
Creating that environment, right? It's the leader's responsibility to create the environment so that these things go well.
And if I could just chime in right there, I think there's also a real benefit to something you said, which is practicing. And, it's funny, because I've got a kid who goes to a maritime academy, and she talks about some of the exercises people go through, because eventually a lot of her classmates are going to end up working on ships, and stuff goes wrong, but you don't know what's going to go wrong. You don't know what the circumstances are. And in the case of organizations, I think it's a normal human tendency to sort of default to what we experience on an ongoing basis is going to perpetuate itself. It's like emotional inertia. And So then we hit a point where leaders say we have to change, and they themselves and the whole rest of the organization are completely unprepared for it. So you just touched on a few elements here of being receptive, being open, being able to respond, having certain muscle memory. Change is a lot easier when leaders already pay attention, listen, evolve, respond proactively. Make sure that what they pronounce from the lectern in front of a town hall is actually followed through on through their actions, right? Because too many times, and I've seen this both in corporate jobs and in a consultative sense, leaders stand up and they express something that on paper looks great and it sounds really good in the room, and there's an ovation and this sort of summit moment of yes and energy. And the reality is they haven't trained for what that exercise is going to be. And so scaling the sort of steep slope of enacting the challenge in a lot of cases puts even more scrutiny on them and how authentic their behaviors are or how aligned their behaviors are with these assertions of we're going to change. Because, going back to those three questions of, why are we doing this? What's in it for me? Right? The skepticism that each individual in an organization may bring can oftentimes be traced back to the role modeling that they perceive. And if they don't perceive their leaders are truly committed, or that their leaders have thought through this, or that their leaders are capable of the evolution that they're asking everyone else to take on, then, to go back to one of your examples, then if I'm in a functional group that has to execute, I'm like, maybe I don't revolt against this, but maybe I drag my feet because I think those leaders are going to move on.
Yeah.
Right? And so you get different ways that either accelerate or add drag to the change initiative. And they're not always evil. Sometimes they're really pragmatic from an individual sense. And, that's where the fun comes in for somebody like me, because I love this stuff. But, for a lot of other people, it drives a ton of frustration.
Yeah. So I think if I was going to summarize kind of some of the key points that we talked about today, right? Practice. So practice change so that you can get good at it, whether that's drills or just really leaning into change, even when it's something small. Model the behaviors you want to see as a leader.
Yes.
You got 2 ears and 1 mouth, so listen more than you speak, maybe as a leader. And kind of something you were talking about is find influencers throughout your organization. So you talked about making sure you understand who those people are, across functions, but also up and down the organization.
Absolutely.
Because only hearing it from the leader makes it maybe less impactful from their friend at the water cooler or who they side chat with or whoever that is, right? Making sure you have those other influencers in the organization.
On that point, when corporations started to go to open office environments, it enabled a really simple observation. Just sit in one of those spaces and observe where people congregate, around whose desk do they end up, because you can actually identify where the nexus points are. Who are the connectors within the organization who can play those influential roles? And oftentimes, if you can get some early adoption from those folks, they help soothe frayed nerves. They help settle people down. They're able to say, hey, we may not see all of it, but we can move forward on this. And, for a lot of these big initiatives, the challenge is not to land the end result. It's to take the next right step over and over and over again and end up in a different space. And that's probably for another conversation. But this has been great. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the chat today. I think we'll just leave you all with there's going to be an impact to the change, and you probably don't know what it is. So listen and pay attention to what everyone throughout your organization is saying. Thanks, Gary.
Thank you. Take care.